El ICA le da la bienvenida a este evento y agradece su participación. Estas son algunas recomendaciones para mejorar la calidad de la videoconferencia. Habilite su micrófono solo en el momento que le den la palabra. Es importante mantenerlo en silencio cuando otra persona está hablando. Por favor, tener encendida la cámara en todo momento para que otras personas lo puedan ver. Si necesita atender algo personal, puede apagarla y encenderla al volver. Agradecemos por favor poner en silencio sus teléfonos celulares para evitar alguna interrupción en la videoconferencia. Recomendamos cuide su postura y su posición frente al computador. Para esta reunión contaremos con interpretación simultánea a través de la plataforma Zoom. En la parte inferior del Zoom encontrará un icono con un globo, con la palabra Interpretación. Por favor, dar clic en esta opción y seleccionar el idioma que desea escuchar. Es muy importante que seleccione alguna de las opciones al momento de hablar, ya que esto permitirá una mejor interpretación. Al finalizar el video, les pedimos el favor de hacer silencio durante 30 segundos. Una vez finalizado ese tiempo, el moderador o conductor puede iniciar la reunión. Muchas gracias por su atención.
Muy buen día a todos. Muchas
Good
gracias
morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. We have over 300 people registered throughout the American continent. There is much interest on animal well-being, and also because we have some highly recognized speakers who are joining us from Canada, Mexico, and Colombia. We are here from the offices of ICA in Canada, Ottawa, Canada, and ICA is a specialized organization for agriculture of the Inter-American system that supports member states to attain agricultural development and rural well-being through international technical cooperation of high excellence. Among all the different activities of ICA, we have the development of these activities to bring international speakers to share their experiences. During the next 90 minutes, we will be listening to our three panelists or speakers, and at the end, we will have a Q&A session. We invite you to share via the chat box your questions as you listen to the presentations, and you can start sharing with us. For now, where are you connecting from? We have simultaneous interpretation available in English and Spanish. You just need to click on the globe icon and you can select the language of your preference. We look forward to have a very reaching conversation. We're going to start with the opening remarks by Ana Marisa Cordero Peña, Specialist Technician of the HFS of ICA from our headquarters in Costa Rica. Go ahead, Ana Marisa, the floor is yours. Good morning, everyone. I hope you are doing really well. Greetings from Costa Rica. And thank you very much for your interest in participating in this webinar that we have organized for today, which is, as it was mentioned before, an effort between ICA via the representation of the delegation in Canada and the AHFS program. For us, it is a true pleasure to be able to have this webinar today because within the framework of the HFS guide, we have the development of sharing new practices and experiences and have the opportunity or the possibility to learn from well-known experts. And in this way, we can also support countries to have a greater understanding about new topics that may be arising and that it is very important for officials, to the private sector, through the industry, the producers' organizations can get to know about, to be able to define towards the future the best way to deal with things. So today is just one more example of the efforts we are undertaking. I would like to congratulate Vivian, Graciela Peña, who have supported us through the program, and the delegation in Canada. And I would also like to thank our presenters for their willingness and availability to participate here. So I would like to thank you once again and just say that based on these efforts, all together, we can learn, share experiences, and that this will allow us not only to implement local initiatives, but also implement regional initiatives as we develop strategic partnerships that allow us to improve and be more competitive. I hope everything goes well and wish you the greatest of success. Thank you all. Well, thank you very much, Ana Marisa. Thank you for your opening remarks. Now we're going to go back to Canada with our very first presenter, Professor Esa Vacero, Associate Professor of Science, Animal Science in McGill, and Director of Insert Nova Light, Dairy Farmers of Canada, Malacta, on sustainability of we will have the biography of Dr. Vester online, so you can check it. Welcome, Dr. Vester. Your floor is yours.
Thank you, Vivian. So I hope you hear me well. I will now share my screen. There we go. And it's not shared, right? So, okay. Do you see my screen? Yes? It's all good? Excellent. Okay, so thanks everybody to join us. My mandate today was really to talk about the welfare dairy cows, where we had today, what are the benefits, and specifically talking about the work that we do in Canada, that I do in Canada with dairy farmers, specifically on commercial farm as well. So because I'm the first speaker, I will start to talk a little bit more broadly about animal welfare. So there are standards for dairy farms around the world everywhere. Here is an example of Australia. Improve well-being, improving animal welfare is part of standards together with, for example, environmental sustainability, but as well ensuring the livelihood of farmers. So assessing dairy welfare is really a commonplace in many countries, with the idea that improving welfare will help to the overall dairy farming sustainability, both by enhancing profit and reducing environmental impact. And many of those initiatives are either industry or stakeholder-led initiatives. In general, assessing welfare really aim to earn the public trusts. They're part of consumer insurance programs, and the idea is to doing the right thing and to show the metrics to support that. There's a verification system where you need to reach targets and show progress over time, and there's a lot of potential for commercial communications on those progress. So what's animal welfare? I will not go too deep in that definition, but it's a broad concept that encompasses many different aspects of the life of the animal. I particularly like the definition from my colleague from UBC, David Fraser, where the idea is we have the basic health and functioning of the animal. So we need to have an animal in good health. We need to provide an animal in an environment that at least mimic natural living. And we need to touch as well on the affective states of those animals. So in animal assessments today, we have typically two types of indicators that are assessed, either risk factors or outcome measures of welfare. So the risk factor are typically in the housing-based measure, type of animal density, the size of the stalls, of the dairy cows, or management types. So what are the routines, for example, in terms of hoof trimming? Do they have pasture access? That are typically the type of measure that are represented when we want to assess welfare of the animal. What we call the true measure of welfare, or the outcome measures of welfare, really the measure that are taken on the animals, because that's where we can evaluate whatever the environment in terms of housing and management, how does that affect the status of the animal. So today's, and here's an example from the US, typical outcome measure that we find in common schemes are visual evaluation of lameness, body injury, hygiene, and body condition scores. Depending on part of the world, of course, you can have some diversity, but those ones are typically common ones. And they are done through type of visual numerical charts where you evaluate, you go on the farm, you take measure on the animals, and you use detailed definitions, and you score based on a range of score from a no problem at all to eventually a much more problem in terms of animal welfare. So now that we are all on the same page on what we mean by animal welfare, how do we assess that? I will go back to Canada. In Canada, we have a code of practice that is developed with all the stakeholders. So basically, we sit everybody that are an involvement in dairy, the government, the associations, the scientists, the vets. So everybody sits and come to what are the guidelines for dairy, and it's managed by the National Farm Animal Care Council. And after that, we have industry-led initiative like ProAction for Dairy, where the objective is to assess how farmers are following the guidelines. So over 10 years ago, Dairy Farmers of Canada, when they were preparing for the scheme of what we call ProActions for the assessment program, they financed us. I say us because you can see there are a lot of universities and stakeholders that were involved in that type of research to develop a first portrait, somehow of what the status of welfare and how farmers are following the guidelines that exist in Canada. And it's really the way that the research worked in Canada, especially when we talk of dairy cows, there's really a partnership between the industry and the research, both in terms of funding, but as well, collaborations in terms of thinking about priorities and research priorities. So I will talk about work. That work I led when I was doing my postdocs, with supervisor from AFC, but you see a numbers of universities involved. So my job was actually to train, to develop the schemes about how do we assess that welfare, and I designed the studies and train all of our bunch of students that went on a number of farms. So we visited 240 farms in Canada. The objective was to take measure on the animals. So we selected 40 cows per farms, and we measure a number of measures, such as the one I presented earlier. So the body condition score, the lameness, the injuries, so basic ones. We took a lot of measure in barn measures, so to understand the stall dimensions, for example. And we had a questionnaire with the farmers to get information on the routine, and we get information from what is now Lactanet, but at the time was Valacta and Canwet's THI to get performance data. So it's the Dairy Herd Improvement Association, where we have data collected on the milk recording systems, and therefore gather as well economics data. So the objective was really to try to understand what is the status of welfare and what are the risk factors that will explain the status. So what did we find? So we found that whatever the system, so in Canada, we have 3 types of system. We have the tie-stall system, which is predominant and still is. We have the freestall system, and the freestall is split between robotic milking system and conventional parlor freestall system. So whatever the system that we had, we we proved basically that housing condition affects the cow welfare status. And here is some of the animal measures. At the time, we have fewer AMS systems or robotic mix systems, so that's why we only have 20 here. In Canada, we have much more today. So when we look at the typical animal measure and we look at the farm prevalence and we look at what was the target that we had in mind in terms of what is acceptable, we should not reach, for example, 10% for lameness and body injuries. We, we were not surprised because there were studies done elsewhere, but we found that actually we were not meeting target for any of those lesions or lameness type of outcomes. However, Canada seemed to do pretty good in terms of cleanliness, for example, or body condition score. So when we looked at the stall dimensions to try to understand how those measures are related to the environment, well, same thing. We measure, for example, the stall width, the bed length, and the brisket board size, so some element of the stalls. And here I present the results for different provinces of Canada. And because it's all negative, what does that mean is like we measure the difference between the recommendations, so what is the stall, and what we measure. So what we see, and not surprise again, it's very difficult to change size of stalls and building when it's built, and we don't have brand new building everywhere. We noticed that indeed the cows were housed in stalls that were not fitting their body dimension, and that explained the type of outcome that we choose. So an interesting question we had is for the farms that were actually following the current recommendation, what is the impact on the animal? And here is a body of research when we try to look at, okay, so if we move towards, the recommendation, what we found. So, and here specifically for Thai stall, because it's easier, because the cows, it's basically attached to her stall, so we know exactly if she fits or not, if the stall fits or not her body dimensions. So what we found though is like when we were moving toward reaching the recommendation, we have a decrease of some of the outcomes such as injuries, lameness, and resting. We had actually an increase in decrease in cleanliness. And for some of those dimensions of the stall, what we find is like some of the recommendations needed to be reevaluated, because on the farms for which they were following, for example, the dimension for thyroid height, we did find that actually it was increasing the type of problems that we saw. So we had an increase in lameness and injuries, for example, and a decrease in lifetime. Well, that's the question that everybody wants to know is, does it pay to improve comfort? And because we had those dairy herd improvements, DHI type of data, Marianne Viltas-Robichaud did the analytics to say, so basically, if we what is the link between comfort and productivity? Again, on those 240 farms, so what type of portrait did we have? So what we found is basically when we try to decrease the percentage of cows on farm for which we have knee injuries, we actually increase the average creatine milk production. So yes, we were able to find positive links between trying to reduce animal welfare problems by increasing productivity. And we found the same for longevity. Here has the result for free stalls. And we find that either by reducing lameness or increasing the cows that fits the stall length, we have actually a decrease in culling rate or an increase in the percentage of cows in third lactation more. So our ability to keep the animal longer in the herd. Same thing with profitability here, calculated on margin over replacement cost. And both outcome measures are reducing the results on the animal, but also stall-based type of measure risk factor. By reducing the risk factor, we increase the profitability. So once we've done that type of portrait, I continued the work by doing what we call research actions of living lab type of action. And it's very difficult research to conduct on farm, but basically is working directly with farmer and try to understand when something is implemented, how does that change over time? Okay, so we don't have any control on a lot of things because the routine on farm, the management on farms, and the housing conditions are different. But here I will explain body of work that my PhD students, Santiago, Palacio did during his PhD. So basically, the first study was do improvement in housing and management voluntarily applied by producer following a cow comfort assessment improve welfare. So what did we do? So basically, we went back to a number of farms that we visited the first time. And we went 3 years later and we did the exact on-farm assessment. And what we did is like we reassessed farms that where the farmer told us that they basically adopted modifications. We call them the adopters. And we also visited a sample of farms that told us that they didn't do any modifications since they were doing the on-farm assessment. So we picked subsamples of farm for which we knew in assessment 1 that there was a high level of injuries. Those are highly associated with the stall. So, we wanted to target farmers that decided to do modification of the stalls to try to improve or to reduce, the risk factor, and hopefully after 3 years seeing the improvement on the animals. Okay. So what did we find? Well, first of all, we do found that injuries decrease. So here are the scores, so the percentage is the improvement in terms of scores. Okay, so we're not in terms of percentage of injuries, for example, and that's true for each of those. So basically, we had score for different type of dimensions. So for injuries level, we find surprisingly that both adopters and non-adopters improve their scores. So basically, the percentage of cows with injury decrease in both types of farms. And what we found is the adopters had actually improved some aspect of stall design, but not always. And for the other type of dimension, we have a mix and we have a numbers of score for which we have kind of a decrease. So what does that told us? Well, that told us that basically just the awareness of the problem seems to have made something happen on farm. And the other thing is like using the farmers' word on what type of modification has been done didn't seem to be super reliable on our ability to be able to see if change have impacted. Okay, so it proves again that doing that type of research is interesting. I think doing a reassessment is a very positive and important point to do in every strategy for welfare improvement, but there's a need for reassessment to be sure that whatever was done is actually implemented and there's an impact. But that gives a lot of hope for all of those initiatives, showing that yes, being aware of the problem help farmers to take decisions. I will give the example of a second research action type of study that we've done, second study done by Santiago. And at that time, we targeted the improvements. So instead of going to see what the farmers have voluntarily decided to change, we work with them to target some type of modifications. And what we decided to look, it's both improvement of the stalls, but also improvement in management. And in our case, we wanted to look at farmers that provided or not outdoor access. So we work with a number of farms in Canada. On each farm, we have half of the cows that were for which we have improved the housing, half of which we didn't have any modification in the housing. And those modifications were discussed and agreed between the producer and a cow welfare specialist at Lactanet. So we visited the farms over a year with the idea that visit 1, was normally to be able to see is there a difference between the farms that provide outdoor access or not. Visit 2 was after stall modification were applied, so it's kind of short-term evaluation. How long does it take to see some type of improvement? Visit 3 was after winter time. In Canada, cows, even when we provide outdoor access, usually they're confined during winter, so we wanted to see when we provide those type of exercise access all year long, do we see an impact? And visit 4 is what's happening after 1 year. So not surprisingly, what we found is basically body injuries was quite different to start between the farms that providing exercise access or not, with fewer injuries when we were providing some kind of outdoor access. when modification were done, we started to see very few weeks, basically after applying those modification, improvement in terms of injuries, but as well the ability of the cows to move in the stall, so less contact with the dividers, for example. And we have I will stop with that. And yes, we still see a difference between the one that provided exercise and not. In terms of after winter time, we saw that the animals that were provided with continuous access to outdoor were less lame and continue to have less body injuries. And when we went over 1 year, body injury was still showing a difference between exercise and non-exercise. So what did we learn here again? We learned that both modification at the stalls and the type of management, like getting the cows out of the stall for a period of time, seems to help to improve the cow condition. But more work needs to be done again to be able to try to understand really how specific modification on our specific routine could help, to really target specific outdoor outcome measure of welfare, because really it's very difficult in a non-controlled situations like in a farm. Again, farms have different type of routine, it could change over a year. So for us to be able to conduct and to have strong results, it make it very difficult and very challenging, however, very interesting to work on commercial level. So after that, we went back, and that's really the work that we conducted since 2016, at McGill, was really to go back in a research setup and try to understand specifically how specific configuration, for example, of the stall could impact the cow conditions and the productions. And we did one aspect at a time. So for example, we look at the thyroid placement and we test one treatment by comparison to the other. So it's a very long and very controlled type of experiment. And we did that for each of those configurations. And then we find results, right? We found that, for example, wherever we put the tyrrell, unfortunately, the injuries of the neck were moving with the cows. But we did find that basically improved position was helping the cows to actually be less in contact with, the stall, but it was still pretty permanent. So the good thing is when we do control environment type of studies is we can take measures that is very difficult to take on commercial farms. And indeed, we can drive some specific recommendations. So we did a number of experiment as well to try to understand when we put the cows out of the stall. So for example, here is during dry off. If we put cows out of the stall for 8 weeks, what we define. And again, the value of doing that type of work is we were able to, for example, use continuous feed video capture to be able to understand how the cows were resting in the stall. And we said that indeed, getting them out of the stall allow greater type of resting postures. And we can look at fancy type of technology like kinematics to try to understand the mobility of the animal. And here, for example, the improved locomotor abilities for the animal that were out of the stall. So very quickly, because I'm almost out of time, doing research in research facility allows us to do a lot to publish very specific scientific new knowledge. And we worked as well with farmers that decided to use those types of knowledge to apply on their farms. And we have a number of videos, and that's the idea when we work with the industry partners to be able to develop those types of material for farmers. And maybe just to finish on that, all of the work that's been done is now included in the new version of the code of practice. Basically, all of that research nurture the discussion that we have currently in Canada to be able to develop a new code with new recommendations. So with that, I thank all my team. There's so much work that's been done over the years. And I'm here. I thank you for your attention, and I'm here for questions during the panel discussion.
Muchísimas gracias, doctora Vasseur, por su excelente presentación.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vasseur, for your excellent presentation. Here we see the importance of scientific studies to assess and the animal well-being and the positive impact that this has on productivity as well. So thank you very much. Now, let's go to Mexico with our next speaker, Dr. Francisco Galindo. He is a professor of the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine and Animal Husbandry of the National Autonomous University of Mexico. He is also a collaborator for the World Organization for Animal Health. And we're going to share his bio in the chat so you can read it. Welcome, Dr. Galindo.
Gracias por la presentación, gracias por la invitación a...
Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation to ICA, particularly to Miramar Wedges, and for having the opportunity of talking about this research project with this cross-functional approach that we have carried out in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico since approximately 10 years ago. This project is targeted to measuring animal welfare and comparing it with environmental services in response to the urgent need of working in sustainable livestock systems and having animal welfare as a criterion for sustainability of this. And it is science-based, which is part of the objective of this workshop. And as you all well know, we have estimates since a long time ago of the importance of working on these sustainability approaches due to the great challenges to meet the demand in livestock production at the global level that is almost always calculated up to 2050, but the trends for this to continue increasing in the different regions of the planet. The per capita consumption of livestock products is increasing. And at the same time, from my perspective, one of the big challenges that mankind has is to be able to meet with sustainable development goals. And the importance is precisely because systems, livestock production systems, both extensive and intensive, have had an environmental, social, and animal welfare impact that's quite significant. We know that a good percentage of deforestation and loss of biodiversity is greatly due to livestock activities, with great relevance currently to be able to link the loss in biodiversity and the possibility of having outbreaks of zoonotic diseases. Of course, we also have the effects of greenhouse gases, which has been extensively studied, and in general, the contamination of water bodies. This implies many challenges from the environmental perspective, but also from the social perspective, because many of producers in Latin America, Asia, and Africa are small-scale producers, and there is still much social delays from the perspective of poverty, child malnutrition, and many other pending issues from the perspective of how could livestock activity bring benefits over to communities. And on the other hand, even though it is not directly mentioned in the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, we do have a very important global agenda on animal welfare. The National Organization of Animal Welfare has already published a code for members, and we have delays from animal welfare perspective, as Elsa was saying. We have many pending issues in relation to how to link animal welfare as a risk factor and to work on a global farm to reduce the high impact and prevalence of infectious diseases. This entails a significant challenge from the perspective of how to integrate different criteria and apply science, measure synergies, measure balances between these environmental, social, economic, and animal welfare effects. Vivian was saying that we are part of this collaboration center of the World Organization for Animal Welfare of the Americas. This is one of the 4 collaborating centers of this organization. This organization supports itself in collaborating centers and reference labs for a global agenda. And the objectives as an organization center is to have to teach animal welfare, to promote regional integrating approaches, uh, elaborate laws, organize scientific meetings, and in general terms, to support in technical support.
Esta agenda, esta estrategia.
We have integrated this agenda, this regional global strategy for animal welfare, for emphasizing on animal welfare and scientific findings. Elsa was already speaking about the definition of this concept, and I always emphasize that to understand some of the concepts that are related to animal welfare, it's very important to have the scientific foundation of animal behavior, motivation, which is based on proximal causes for the motivation of expressing biologically significant conduct, and the concept of adaptive value that is related to less proximal causes to ultimate causes, but in turn is related to evolution. These concepts are the basis to understand biological environmental response systems, which are the ones that are used to define animal welfare and to identify the biological indicators that are related
Si bien no podemos
for animal welfare. Even though we cannot directly assess the mental state of an animal, we can use other indicators like behavior and physiological indicators that will help us understand, and they help us in this continuous process understand how animals are facing their environment. So based on this scientific approach on animal welfare, we have integrated these other sustainability aspects in the project that we have spoken about in Mexico. We have also used tools to assess these criteria. And I do not have the time today to expand on this, but a little bit on the protocols and tools that we have used. This is analysis of the life cycle, FAO protocols, and other manuals that are called MESMEs that are focused on integrating animal welfare as part of sustainability criteria. As a case study, what we have been doing is measuring a series of variables in behavior, physiology, environmental, etc., in different scales, one at the landscape scale and the other at the production unit, the farm, comparing monoculture systems, conventional systems that in the tropics have been used for decades, comparing this with intensive forest systems that are the systems that combine three vegetation strata, grass, bushes, and trees at the farm level with live fences. And this we have compared with some systems that is in a more natural environment, which is called the field, that as we call it in Yucatan, but it maintains different attributes, fragments of the forest, because the animals can have an enormous diversity of plants. But from the environmental perspective, we are interested in knowing how we can have greater environmental services from the carbon sequestration perspective and biodiversity maintenance. Some results have been quite interesting from the perspective of the microclimate that these forest pasture systems offer livestock. The temperature and humidity index is much lower in the forest than in monoculture, and they offer a microenvironment to livestock that imply less energetic output. One of them, I don't put the number, the data here that we have measured from in the perspective of welfare quality protocols, which is the flea distance, which is a measurement of fear, reactivity, and welfare. It's interesting how in this silvopastoral systems, the cattle are more docile, or they are compared to the conventional monoculture. From the perspective of social behavior, interactive behavior, we have seen that there is the affiliation interactions is higher in silvopastoral systems than in monoculture. And this is also seen in linearity in hierarchy. It's better in silvopastoral herds than in monoculture. And this is also reflected in times for eating, for resting, for grazing, etc. The foraging time during the hours of extreme heat and greater humidity, cattle in forest pasture systems rest more, and they better use foraging times and times for selecting their food compared to monoculture. Consumption of dry matter is optimized, which entails lower energetic expense. And this is also shown in physiological variables. We have taken thermographic pictures in cows that are in both systems, and clearly with the skin temperature of cows in silvopastoral systems is lower than in monoculture. This is also a management of the cows that in the afternoon, night, when the livestock is taken into the corral, we have taking the pictures 2 hours after the cattle coming back from the field. Their temperature is lower compared to cattle coming from monoculture. This also tells us about the energetic expense. And this is also reflected in other variables like respiratory frequency. We have here a comparison in dry and wet seasons. Silvopastoral in black and monoculture in gray. And we see here the differences in respiration. In both cases, it's higher than the normal frequency of the breath rate, but in dry season, it's practically double the normal respiratory rate. What we have been measuring here is the abundance and wealth of different species, birds, bats, and rodents as indicators of biodiversity in the three systems: monoculture, intensive silvopastoral, and out in the natural field. In the monoculture, we have a lower wealth of species. What's the difference here? To a great extent, the abundance of species or hosts that are prone to transmitting zoonotic pathogens, like, for example, the West Nile virus, is higher in monoculture. There is higher abundance of hosts that are prone to transmitting zoonotic variables. And this is an environmental service that's very important from the perspective of what we're experiencing currently, how the management of sustainable livestock systems in the future might mitigate scenarios for future pandemics. The work group of the Yucatan University has done extensive work in animal nutrition and is also working on methane emissions and gas sequestration. And it's important to see that the system in itself offers lots of advantages compared to monoculture. Why? Due to the different vegetation strata, there is a higher carbon sequestration, and due to the diet offered to the animals based on leguminous projects with lots of saponins that modify fermentation at the rumen. And what they do is to reduce by up to 20% the methane secretion. So it entails greater advantages from the gas sequestration perspective. So in this study in particular, this case study, what we have been working on is how to integrate animal welfare measurements to environmental service measurements in a win-win scenario. this win-win situation. But this not always happens, and that's part of the take-home message today is that we need to work in cross-functional studies in every livestock system, intensive and extensive of different species. We need to move forward on an agenda to integrate sustainability criteria in intensive systems of different species, including birds, because not always are we going to find that win-win scenario. We have all these scenarios of trade-offs. The message is more cross-functional projects we have to advance in this agenda and this sustainable development. It seems that also animal welfare agenda is going to be able to translate into a global and local policy that's more efficient. Thanks to the working group, which is very broad, not only in Mexico and other universities in the world. Thanks again to ICA and congratulations to the seminar. Thanks to Elsa and congratulations to my fellow speakers. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Galindo. Definitely, this is a especially relevant topic within this context of climate change due to the risk of the emergency of zoonosis. And I agree that animal welfare has to be part of the indicators. Finally, we are going to go to the south. For now, let's go to Colombia with Master Ricardo Mora. He's the manager of the farm animal manager of the World Animal Protection, and he is in charge of animal welfare and production in the livestock industry. Welcome, Master Mora. Vivian, thank you very much. I hope that you can hear me well. I would like to send a very warm greeting to ICA for this opportunity. And it's such a pleasure to see again my good friend Francisco and meet Elisa through this opportunity. I'm going to share my screen right now, and I'm going to put on the new presentation. Would you please confirm if you can see it fine? Yes, we can. Perfect. So I have a lot to talk about. I am going to try to reach public health, even though we see it in less detail. To begin with, it's important to tell, just as many other issues in the world, animal welfare, what people can talk about this, say about this on animal welfare, depends on their own experiences. We all have different experiences and a different story to tell about the same topic. In this case, animal welfare brings us over here, and we have heard how we can have more abolitionist currents on well-being, protectionist issues, or they're more that utilitarists. But today, what we are going to be talking about animal welfare is represented on this picture here. Animal welfare as an opportunity, as Francisco and Elsa said, that this is for animals not only to be better, but for systems to be more sustainable in greater harmony so that we can have that win-win. So along these same lines, my presentation today is divided into 4 aspects. The first one is animal production. The second one is a relatively new term for the industry, which is that concept of social license. Afterwards, we're going to be looking at the direction of the industry facing animal welfare, and we are going to end with a general overview on public health, because we could have a full workshop on public health and animal welfare. So to speak about animal production, it is important to understand that the different animal production systems in the world respond to the needs of the market, to what the market is requesting. So according to global statistics, we have approximately billion animals in the world without counting fish are animals for production. Perhaps this is the largest number of animals, not counting fish. This production system, some are live in the backyard, others are live in family with families, but most are intensive confinement systems or industrial scale systems. Unfortunately, the productive pressure leads to having industrial scale systems supporting and very strong resources to be able to reach their purpose. In this case, it is supported in the use of pesticides and, as Francisco says, in monocrops, not only grass as such, but we could also have soy and corn and other grains to feed animals. This is a strong monocrop. This oftentimes generates deforestation. There is evidence, and Vivian can tell us in the chat a couple of links for our publications with evidence where we can see how a large amount of soy that is produced in El Chaco, in the Amazon area in Brazil, is also sponsoring this increase in deforestation and forest fires as a result of the growth in livestock, but also as a result of soy monocrop growth. And another thing that we can highlight from this intensive production is the broad utilization of antibiotics that we're going to try to cover at the end of the presentation. All this is to let you know that intensive production evidently generates effects in public health. And in this link that Vivian is going to be sharing, we're also going to be finding a recent study published by Wild Animal Protection this year on the effects that intensive production has in public health. There are effects in the environment. And once again, I let you know that soon on August 29th, we're also going to be launching a study where we measure the effects of poultry and pig production in environmental parameters like soil use, warming, etc. You can expect that for August 21st. This deforestation has brought over effects in biodiversity. Also, Francisco gave us a wonderful presentation showing how these indicators can be measured out in the field. It is evident how animal welfare can positively impact. And this way we do create also intensive production, which can bring over effects in food security, because even though we think that we are feeding the world, scientific evidence shows that many of the resources that we're using go more to animal feeding than to feeding humans. So it's not true that we think that intensive animal production is going to lead us to a world without food. That's not totally true. I bring over some projections that Francisco mentioned, and I detail them a little bit more. When we compare meat production, we can see that by 2018, growth was 470 more than 50 years ago. If we compare it with human production, we can see that this figure is much lower. It means that the consumption of animal-based protein is growing faster than human population. And also projections as of 2030 show us that the growth of emerging economies is also occurs according to meat consumption in this case. As you can see in the graph below here, we can see how continents such as Africa, Asia Pacific, and Latin America have the higher growth percentages. In the graph on top, we can see how this projected growth is seen. Poultry is the main growth, almost 18%, followed by lamb, and then pigs, and the lesser scale, 6%, bovine meat. Once this has been said, we can understand that the growing demand due to meat consumption causes or provokes that industries have to increase productive pressure on livestock systems. This has a limit, and here we have the case that we're going to be presenting where we can lose that social license. If these productive systems go to the limit and they continue advancing in the direction that was originally stated during the Industrial Revolution, this is so not going to be sustainable and we're going to be losing our social license. Let's take a look at a case that allows us explaining the concept of social license. I am not going to name any company, even though this is public information, because this is not about putting any evidence on any company on the spot. This is about the products mostly. In this case, this was in Chile. We see the map of the country, Chile, in the northern region, which is marked here in red, which is the Atacama region. It's to the southern area of Atacama. We have that population called Freirina. This is a relatively small area, 6,000 inhabitants, many are rural. And we have this construction of this mega project, which was thought for 2.5 million pigs, in total 70,000 hectares for this dedicated to this project. The company, it has $400 million. Its construction took 10 years and it began in operations in 2011. So it's not up to May 2011. A long year after it begins operating, we have a social explosion. I do not intend the video. Please, Vivian, let me know. I'm just going to tell you what I see of the video, and you're going to be able to see subtitles in English. This is what happened in the La Freirina. We see people moving against, they're protesting, manifesting against the company and against rural production. In international means, this case was called the pig business in Chile. It tells us how in La Freirina, the population is affected by bad odors, by the increase in flies, by using water sources, underground waters, which were essential for the livelihoods of people, and how these underground water was being affected by this mega production project. And this is how they are going to speak about this antimicrobial are contaminating water and people. This is where we exhaust social license, where we begin with this protection system. This is where we began in a pacific manner, and little by little it became a social problem. People invading in the premises, damaging, and we are going to, this is where people are get tired and they block the entrance of the farm, and this is how they block the feed for animals, affecting the exit of the animals and generating an environmental project and environmental issues and animal welfare problems. Many of the lessons that were learned here is, in this case, the company lost all its investment. It closed definitely the premises. We had this serious impact in their reputation. This was a media scandal. And they also promote the elaboration of standards on odors, on bad and foul odors in Chile. It's not in this particular case, but in other, this is a publication on the Red Meat Advisory Council. They say, what happens if the if the animal protection industry doesn't do anything today to improve externalities, the utilization of water, fair job, the environmental issues? What would happen if they don't do anything? And in their study, they are telling about an annual loss of almost $3 million, which would generate a very significant impact in consumers in the industry. A summary of all these experiences is showing that there are many things with which we can work and we can anticipate them to avoid losing social license. Some of these areas are the environment, worthy jobs, animal welfare, as Francisco was talking about, and public health. I'm going to focus on the last two ones, and animal welfare and public health. What has the industry done in animal welfare? Remember that we have equality and environment, but let's speak specifically about animal welfare. What has industry done? If we base ourselves on the value chain, we have the producer, they sell their products to an industry that markets them and transforms them and then goes to the consumer. But this basic value chain can be even more complex if we put it in more in detail. Uh, this mainly due to the function of consumers who also contribute and are taxpayers and voters in the countries. This affects. I know that I hope that you can see the arrow as it moves. It affects policies and it somehow also intervenes in in commercial trade-off policies. Everything that consumers do that are also voters and their vision and well-being on social license that they have on production systems can affect. This is considerably increased if we consider financial sustainability of businesses, global warming, climate change, and also all this managed by the media. And this has expanded exponentially if we take into account social networks. If we add a factor that we have a factor that is generations, how each generation regards of this, we can reach very important conclusions. Deloitte a few years ago said that by 2025, which is close, 75% of uh, the workers in the world are going to be millennials. Up to 2000, 2005, those millennials who might be around 42 years old today, the early millennials are much more aware. These are more aware consumers. And I bring an example here. In a country like Mexico, if you
We see a lady buying eggs. And if you see that these are vegetarian eggs, that's what the industry said. So the industry understood that they need to change its practices to not to lose its social license, and they start looking for mechanisms that can reach the consumers and reach more specific markets. And so let me show you a specific example in this 6 minutes that I have left, or maybe 5, because we're going to leave 1 minute for public health in the part of collective gestation. When the industry has animal welfare commitments to have this collective gestation, we always understand that these are systems like the ones you see on the screen. This is not always work in the practice. Here, this is something that I did to understand food industry and tourism, which are the commitments they have made to stop purchasing meat that is coming from individual gestation, cage meat, and to buy from gestation systems, which is much more environmentally friendly. These companies committed in not only in North America, but in Latin America, but also worldwide. And here we see that it's not only the obvious industries like for food trade and quick food, fast food, but we also have some also in the tourism industry. And in this slide, we have other industries like animal production industry. And here I'm just only mentioning some of the largest meat producers worldwide that know about collective gestation. And here we have some big question here. Are they committing to these commitments that they established a few years ago? Well, let me show you a number of slides about this. And first, I would like to say that the way the implementation is seen in practice is different from the one we all have in our minds. So here we have 4 different systems in the Netherlands, North America, Brazil, and Colombia that comply with the principle of group gestation that is range-free, but there are different levels in terms of welfare. So I'm telling you this because of the reason that, yes, we have a number of commitments by the industry, but how are these commitments really being fulfilled? So I'm going to be showing you this material that I really like. This is a report that is a famous one. It is the business benchmark on farm animal welfare, which is a volunteer in company that that puts together the information that is available by industries and has to do with the production sector and food chains, including restaurants and bars. This report has been widely read by investors. Investors that you can see in the slide handle, and this was a few years ago, probably here we have a greater amount. It's like $1.3 trillion in assets under management. So this is important for consumers, for producers in this change, but also for investors. Here we see this year's report that was published at the beginning of the year on how these companies are classified on these 6 tiers. And I don't think you can see it or read it because it's very small. But what matters here is that we can highlight that the very same report as of this year presents a different tier, E and F categories, where companies are demonstrating an evolution, but they need to show direct impact of animal welfare. And so what they're doing is actually representing a positive change for animals. And these are some of the parameters that they measure. For example, the number of animals outside the extreme confinement. And this is something that we have the commitment from 2014 till 2020. The animals with environmental enrichment. This was reported as of 2019, animals without mutilations, the percentage of animals that have with insensibilization prior to sacrifice, animals with safety stunning, the percentage of animals with transportation less than 8 hours, and the number of companies reporting outcome type welfare measures that were also mentioned by previous speakers. So this is part of the report, and I'm aware that I only have 2 minutes. Maybe, William, I'm going to go over by a couple of minutes from my time. I apologize in advance for that. And so it is important to understand that here we see the geographical relationship of where these improvements in animal welfare are happening. Here we have like the cradle for animal welfare, when we can see that this is much more advanced. And we see that is the UK, but we see in Latin America a very interesting development regarding the management commitments and also regarding the governance and management commitments in animal welfare, innovation and leadership. We also see a very good position by Latin America. It's a bit behind, North America is a bit behind. And here in this part of performance reporting and impact is where we see that the companies need to work much more. And I'm going to conclude by saying that something that is really good is that producers and manufacturers are the ones who at the head or the lead of all these things that have to do with animal welfare. And now I'm going to close with in this last minute that I'm going to steal from Vivian to talk about public health very quickly and animal welfare. As it was mentioned before, you can look at our last study, and there we have scientific, concrete evidence from different parts of the world in which industrial systems that are highly intensive, which are not only bad for animal welfare, but also can lead to problems to zoonosis and antimicrobial resistance. It can lead to unsafe and adulterated foods. It can lead to environmental contamination, generating environmental risks, particularly when we talk about meat processing facilities. There are some important severe risks, and this was highlighted during COVID, and risk labor and healthy diets and food insecurity. So one specific example would be the relationship between animal welfare and public health, human health. Here we have some of the most amazing statistics led by the World Health Organization. And this is just a quick data so that we can start with the Q&A session. These data that are just amazing. 75% of all antibiotics used worldwide are being used in animal production, even though many countries like Brazil, where colistin has been forbidden for animal production, in our soil and water studies, we find antimicrobial resistance to these antibiotics that are critical for treating humans. It is estimated that 131 tons of antibiotics a year are being used for animal production, particularly to treat sick animals and as a growth promoter and as a prophylactic use in groups of animals. And this final slide shows us how the route for contamination be seen with antimicrobial resistance, with resistant bacteria that is not only done through meat, but also through the body source, the water sources, and the stool of animals that is used as fertilizer that might actually lead to be used to vegan or vegetarian consumers. And finally, we see that 1.2 million people are dying every year from infections that cannot be treated with antibiotics. And this is considered the next pandemic that by 2015, this number due to antimicrobial resistance might actually reach 10 million people. Vivian, I apologize for that minute that I went over my time, and I would just like to thank you all for your attention. Thank you. No problem. Dr. Mora, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. Definitely, we want to hear more about this topic that has to do with public health. And we are doing really well time-wise because we had saved a number of minutes from the previous presentations. So we're doing great time-wise. To begin officially with our Q&A session, I don't see any questions in the chat box still. I have a number of questions that I have written from what you have been saying, but I would like to give participants a chance first. If please feel free to write your question in the chat box or raise your hand and we will give you the floor to ask your question.
O tal vez será que todo quedó muy claro.
Maybe everything is crystal clear. Gloria, Daniela, I don't know. I don't see any questions. I don't see any hands raised. I'm not sure though. No, for now, we don't have any hands raised. So let me start with my questions because this is a topic that is much interest and importance to me. I would like to ask all of you, because all of you collaborate with producers, with the academia, with the industry, with the government. How difficult is it to attain all these sectors collaboration to take into consideration and foster animal welfare programs and initiatives? And as Dr. Galindo was saying, how can animal welfare be positioned prior to other priorities that have to do with economics? Any of you can take the answer, or maybe you can all answer, whatever you want. Any volunteer? I can start. Or Francisco? No, you go ahead, Ricardo. Thank you. It's nice to greet you, Francisco. Well, what I think is that talking about animal welfare is now becoming ever more important in terms of economics, because it's been demonstrated that systems with welfare may be very productive. And that's a graph that was published a number of years ago by McKinney, and where there was no conflict between welfare and productivity. You can demonstrate that. And it depends on the species, of course. In our case, in our experience in bovine, the relationship is very direct. I have another example. In pig production or swine production, we can demonstrate that a farm that is built with better animal welfare standards, like group stations, has a return on environment of 2 years earlier than a conventional farm. So animal welfare is not only a topic that has to do with ethics, but it's also a topic that is closely related with productivity. And I truly believe that there's a win-win situation for all, for producer, for consumer, for the industry, for the world, for the environment. So definitely, yes, it is relevant, and it is an economic topic that is relevant for the industry and important for the industry. Thank you very much, Doctor. Now, Dr. Galindo, would you like to add something? Yes, I agree completely with what Ricardo just said. In my experience here in Mexico is that it's always been good to talk about animal welfare as a tool, as a strategic tool. And of course, it depends on where you are. You can maybe highlight certain concepts or scientific basis or this ethical component of the concept. But in the long run, with producers, with the authorities that are supposed to make decisions, when you demonstrate to them that animal welfare has an added value that can be economic, but that it also in some sectors, in some markets, it doesn't necessarily have to be economic. It doesn't have to do with producing more, but just because it has an added value that may have an impact on a different market. Just like with environmental topics, that's how I believe we've been able to move forward. Integrating the animal welfare policies with other public policies for food productions. And I think that's at the global level, currently and after the pandemic particularly, has had a greater impact. The fact that now we can hear WHO together with the FAO and the WOAH to talk about health and policy of welfare. And this has all to be supported based on science and be able to measure the synergies and trade-offs and the added value that you have in animal welfare. And it will also depend much on what we're talking about with regards to the productive systems and what type of product we're talking about. I think there's no ideal one size fits all. And then society then will have to decide little by little.
Muchas gracias, doctor Galindo. Doctora Elsa, ¿algo que quisiera agregar sobre esta pregunta?
Thank you very much, Dr. Galindo. Dr. Elsa, is there anything that you would like to add?
Yeah, just one little thing is it's true that we have proof that animal welfare is linked with productivity and profitability, but the reality to help farmers to make decisions on their farm, we need to have the tools that show that on their farm there's actually a return of the cost that to improve animal welfare measures. Because I think everybody wants to improve animal welfare. All the farmers I met want to improve animal welfare, but the reality is like how much does that cost and how much do I gain from that? So I think today with precision livestock, with all of the data that we have, we should be able to develop decision and tool to help farmers to really try to understand which cow need to leave the herd right now, how much, how long will it be before whatever improvement I do in my housing will pay off. Because the reality is like the margin that farmers have to make a living of their production is very thin. And I think it's true everywhere. So I think there's globally, we know that the equation works well, but the reality, we need to have the tool to help farmers to take decisions on day-to-day basis to really be able to implement appropriate measures.
Muchas gracias, doctora Baseo.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vassar. This is a topic that I wanted to continue on with the questions, which is that in relation to the importance of the producers, the farmers, because we think on the smaller scale producers, could you share strategies that you have used to work with so that producers are more open, more receptive to improving their management practices for improving animal welfare? Yes, thank you, Vivian. That's a complicated question. It's like a university dissertation thesis. I think that in the producer groups that we have interacted mostly in the southern part of Mexico, they're feeling that security that they can be change agents. I think that helps, not having them depend on government policies, that they do not necessarily depend on the specific interest of a company, for them to be the ones that get organized, the ones that collectively can express their concern or interest. I think that being able their tool for security to be able to push the policies from the perception of the producers, I think, or I feel in any way, that's something that's going to be impacting more in the future. Thank you.
Definitivamente coincido.
Yes, I definitely agree. Yes, Mr. Mora. Thank you, Vivian. According to our experience, we have seen that producers, whether large, medium, or small scale, they accept well the welfare issue when it goes together with proposals, as Elsa says, when they go with very specific implementation ideas. I also think that Latin America has a big advantage above other parts in the world, and that it can be reflected in the business benchmark study, which is that the legislation on animal welfare in Latin America has been a lot slower than what it was like in Europe. In Europe, it happened, and after 2013, the real decree made the countries in the European Union to implement welfare measures, weaning out of cages, and this took all producers by surprise. We have Spanish and French producers that have gone bankrupt. In Latin America, we have an interesting phenomenon, I think, in two ways. One, because the industrialization level was perhaps not so high as it could have been in the countries in North America or Europe. So we have not yet reached that very high industrialization level that allowed for there being more leeway to go back to the roots. In livestock, most of the agri-food systems in Colombia is extensive livestock production. We should later see implications with environment, but that's apart. It's extensive livestock production. Another thing is that producers wanted to go faster than legislation, which could be really good. I talk about Colombia, that's where I live, but we see examples of Chile, but especially Colombia, where producers associations have advanced so fast for the implementation of animal welfare before legislation demands for it. I believe that this is very important for this question. Thank you. Yes, definitely. Thank you very much for sharing your experience. Dr. Vazer, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I think I always, when we talk about that question, I always think that there's regionality in that. You know, in Europe, for example, the animal welfare improvement is very much pushed on the legislative side. In Canada, I like to explain that the system is different, where basically it's a really, all the stakeholders stick together to decide what are the guidelines. But it's that consensual type of work is typical Canada, you know, so that we all need to agree, and I think that's good. That help the dialogue between the consumers, the industry partners, you know, the restaurant chain, etc. But at the same time, it takes time. So for example, reviewing the new guidelines, because we have so much evidence now that we can improve, and we need to move from the 2019 to a new version. We sat on that since 2019. So, you know, it's a very long process. We know that we are reaching the end, and we'll have something published in 2023. But basically, it's a lot of time. COVID kicked in, that didn't help. But what I mean is like the dialogue between the different stakeholders to come up with what do we believe are the standards today. I think it's a very efficient system, and definitely the system that's working in Canada. And the example for dairy is the same for all the animal production that we have. Currently, we're reviewing the goat standard as well. So that's what I wanted to add. Thanks.
Muchas gracias, doctora Vaso.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vaser. We are reaching the end of our workshop. I would like to close with the request to each of you to deepen on the importance of animal welfare and public health. Dr. Galindo spoke
El link que hay entre la pérdida de
about the relationship we have between the loss of biodiversity and the emergence of zoonotic diseases. And Mr. Moore also spoke about this within the context of zoonosis and the current pandemic. What can you tell us about how we can promote these strategies that focus animal welfare and health and impact public health issues? Dr. Galindo? It also seems that in the animal welfare agenda, we have also emphasized on the effect of the issue and not so much on the causes of the animal welfare issues. And there we have an interesting opportunity from the scientific approach perspective in research lines of fields that allow us linking animal welfare as an epidemiological risk factor. I think that we have not done much in that regard to see how animal welfare issues are the cause of an epidemiological issue. And to the extent that we can link these issues, we could have a much more efficient prevention strategy, improving welfare levels of the different animals and the different systems. That would really help us move forward in a welfare health agenda. Thank you, Vivian. Thank you, Dr. Galindo. Could I compliment? Yes, go ahead. Thank you, Vivian. I think that for this to be possible, it is necessary to have more stakeholders involved. Antimicrobial resistance has always been treated from the medical standpoint. Physicians, hospitals, city residues, pharmacology, and on the other hand, we had antimicrobial resistance from the animal perspective, veterinarians, zootechnicians, nutritionists. Recently, we began associating both things. So this is like finding how organizations that work on antimicrobial resistance
webinars donde están
in
sentados.
Latin America are generating webinars with physicians, nurses, producers, veterinarians, and zootechnologists. This is what we're beginning to do. As Francisco says, we're linking the causes, and we have left aside that public health and antimicrobial resistance issue is just what the end consumer can do with the way in which they take their medicines. But no, on the contrary, this is from the farm way behind and how this can reach rivers or meat. These strategies, when we begin relating this, when the dialogue of well-being or health ceases to be up to veterinarians only or just production industry and becomes something that's more, I don't know, for all, that would be ideal. Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Vazer, a final comment?
No, I don't have anything to add. I think on that topic we've been covered.
Okay. Muchas gracias. Pues llegamos al final del tiempo que teníamos asignado para este webinar.
Thank you very much. We have reached the end of the time that we have assigned for the webinar. Thank you very much to all for your participation. While enriching with your participation, I really want to thank our speakers, our technical team in Ottawa, the interpreters for their work, and the most important part, our audience. You're going to be able to access the recording of this webinar on the IGA webpage. And please stay in touch with IGA's networks for coming events, and we hope to see you all soon. Have a great day, all of you. Thank you, Vivian. Greetings, Ricardo, Elsa. Greetings to all. Thank you.